and not being so hard on yourself, not holding yourself so strictly against things that you've done that you might disagree with today, and forgiving yourself, forgiving those people around you, really it provides a sense of freedom where you can now move forward into the future. And I think that the beauty in being vulnerable is really allowing yourself to feel and experience life in all its forms. And to love is an incredible feeling. To love a person, to love a family member, to love your spouse or your girlfriend or your boyfriend, to love your work, and to love your career choice, and to love nature, and to love all these small and simple things that we do have in our life that we often take for granted, is being vulnerable. And it might be hard, especially if you've suffered a lot in the past, but it will really enable you to feel so incredibly grateful and happy in life, that I think vulnerability is very closely linked to happiness.
Hello, boys and girls, and welcome back to another episode of The Outcome Podcast with me, your host, Matt Schiff. On today's episode, I have a conversation, or you'll hear a conversation with me and a lady named Tatiana Sharpe, who is the co-founder of an incredible organization called Global Impact Network, is still today recognized as the youngest Zimbabwean author, and has an incredible story, which I will give a bit more of an introduction to in just a moment. Prior to that, though, I thought I would recommend listening to episode number 7, if those of you who are tuning in now haven't yet had the chance to do so, which was a recording done with 2 of my dear friends and ladies from the Future Females movement. As a reminder, Future Females is a movement that exists to connect, inspire, and support current and aspiring female entrepreneurs. They rapidly have increased the number and success of the women that have been involved with their organization. And essentially, they're in a remarkable platform that provides an environment, more so now digitally, obviously, due to the current environment that we're in at the moment. But they also have physical locations where they do everything from workshops, live talks, panels, conversations in general, business schools, where women as well as men can emotionally connect with each other and access resources that they need to succeed. The movement was founded by Lauren Dallas and Serena Bezernote in August 2017, and as such has grown over 60 contributors, more than 3,000 global members. They're in over, I think, 30 cities around the world by now. I've attended a few of their live webinars during the course of the lockdown, which have all been very, very insightful, very rewarding to just sit and gain experience from the people which they bring on, the skill sharing which they're allowing the public to gain access to. As mentioned, it's simply remarkable. The conversation I had with both Flora and Sasha at the time was one that dug a little bit deeper into what Future Females is trying to achieve with female entrepreneurs. But also it sort of tried to unpack their niche in a world of entrepreneurship, and engage the community to create safe spaces for women globally, where women can feel vulnerable, they can give and receive feedback, and they can share wins and losses alike from all walks of life, and crossing a variety of barriers and geographic locations and all sorts of preconceived ideas that I suppose most of us have in our day-to-day in entrepreneurship and in life in general. So it was a very, very insightful episode. And as mentioned, it was a massive milestone for me to have the ladies on and record that episode. I would highly encourage you to have a squiz and give that a listen. Episode 11 boasts the very impressive Tatiana Sharpe, whom I had the privilege of chatting to not too long ago. Tatiana is still today recognized as Zimbabwe's youngest author. She is a co-founder and a CEO, a business owner, obviously, team member of Global Council for the NGO World Merit, as well as a speaker at the United Nations. She is an incredible philanthropist through numerous volunteer programs, which this episode promises to enthrall you the way it did me. Whilst Tatiana is certainly all of these things mentioned previously, this conversation was so beautifully recorded as its content contains her experiences, stories, tribulations, and her journey up to now that have helped shape her into the woman she is today. David, who is a mutual friend of ours, had connected us not too long ago. He was episode 4's guest, David Clancy, and the way in which he described her journey and who she is as a person really had me intrigued, had me curious from the get-go, and I had to extend the invitation out to Tatiana to get her on the show. Upon meeting her, she had me engrossed in the bits and pieces of life that had helped mold not only her worldview, but the worldview of all the people she interacts with daily. My perception initially in this episode was to unpack more of the stories around her successes. What is it like being recognized as Zimbabwe's youngest author? To find out more about her current business, Global Impact Network, as well as dig right into the belly of her experiences speaking at the United Nations in 2016 in front of a room full of trustees. However, this conversation took a slightly different spin. Her CV definitely boasts a very impressive journey from the time most of us were pretty much learning to read. However, double-clicking to have a look beneath the surface of her accomplishments, you will find a human being that is a solemn humanitarian. And plunging both feet with me into a conversation around immense vulnerability, you will hear Tatiana open up and share some of her stories that just had me captivated from the get-go, and I sure hope has you captivated as well. I'd like to introduce to you Tatiana. Hello, Tatiana. How are you today?
Hey, Matt. I'm doing very well, thank you. It's been a hectic night for me with work, but I'm super excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for taking the time. We were chatting just a little bit earlier, and you mentioned how you're on the back of 4 hours of sleep. You're jumped onto a podcast recording with me. And I've no doubt that things have been quite hectic on your side. I appreciate you taking the time. So thank you for doing so.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's an absolute privilege to have you on the next recording for the Outcome podcast. I'm fascinated to know a bit more about your story after our initial introduction and conversation not too long ago now. And funnily enough, obviously we spoke about this then, but a mutual friend of ours, David Clancy, who was, I think, on episode 4 of the Outcome podcast for me, had mentioned your name, just to give some context for those that are listening. And he just absolutely raved. Now, David knows a lot of people, and he's got a lot of experience traveling and just meeting some exceptionally interesting folks around the world. And for some reason, the way he expressed your experiences and your name, and I know that you guys actually haven't physically met before.
Yeah, it's crazy.
In hindsight, this also sounds a little bit creepy, but I can assure you it's in no way that. You just mentioned, you brought a bit of your story up, and I just had to reach out as well, and just to find out a bit more for myself who you are and the kind of projects and your experiences up to date. And I really want to just start from the very beginning. Yes, for those that don't really know you, and for those that do. But something which we alluded to in our first conversation, and I'm just looking to gain a bit more information from, is a bit of your personal background from sort of a young adolescence age. You have a website and you have a project or a company called The Lonely Tiger. And on that website and in our conversation, you're actually quoted as being the youngest Zimbabwean author. That's at the time. Do you mind just placing us back there and maybe starting with the kind of just place us in the situation? How did you get into writing, or what were you doing at that time that led to that sort of accomplishment or status in a way?
Sure. Well, yeah, thank you for making that introduction. And just a quick shout out to David if he's listening to this. He's really an awesome individual, and we spoke about this. He's so authentic. So I'm very grateful that David put us in contact. And so that was a great background. I think just for those that don't know, I am still to this day the youngest author in Zimbabwe. I wrote and published The Lonely Tiger when I was 7, and then it was published when I was 8 years old. And so the background story to that is really my upbringing. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, Harare, Zimbabwe. And I'm a bit of a mix in nationalities, a weird mix at one. I'm half Russian, half Zimbabwean. My father's side of the family are English. And so I grew up, obviously, in a very poor country. Zimbabwe is labeled as one of the most economically deficient countries in the world at the moment. And so being born and exposed to so much poverty and social injustice at a young age really fueled my desire to want to make a positive impact. And I definitely owe everything that happened with the Lonely Tiger, I owe fully to my parents. Especially my mother, when I was around 5 years old, from, my first memories, I remember going and visiting charities and orphanages with her. And she is a solemn humanitarian. And by visiting these kids and seeing children that were my age, but that were born and raised in totally different environments, even though it was the same country that I was born and raised in, I started questioning, why I had certain privileges that these kids didn't, like why I had a roof over my head. I had a loving family. Most of the kids were orphans living in orphanages, and why I had 3 meals a day. And I remember going home and asking my parents these questions and like being so confused and realizing that, I'm just living in a totally different world to these kids. And it frustrated me and upset me because I couldn't wrap around my head why what I call today winning the life lottery. And, I learned to read and write at a very young age. My mom and dad both really, really encouraged me to learn reading when I was very young. So I'd already been writing, as any young kid would in their diaries and journals. And I was always writing different stories and trying to, I guess that was also, as an only child, my escape to be creative and write all these different stories. And one day we went to the orphanage at Harare Children's Home. And I remember saying to my mom that I wanted to do something to help them in my own way, because she would always pass me food or clothes and I'd hand it out to the kids. And I basically went home that night and said to my dad, I want to write a book. And I didn't know what the word published meant at the time. But I said, I want to write a book and I want us to sell this book, and all the money we make from this book, I want to give it to these kids for their education. And that's really linked to Nelson Mandela's influence in my life. So there's this quote that I told you before, but I think it might be interesting for listeners to hear about it. And there's this quote that Nelson Mandela once said, which was, education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. And that really stuck with me. And so I understood from a young age that education is so crucial to sustainability and to being self-sufficient. And so when I told my father about this idea, he was I'm very grateful and privileged that my family's always supported my dreams. And I think that's something that I can't take for granted. Because if it wasn't for them, I don't think I would have been able to do all the things that I wanted to do, especially write a book at such a young age. But at the same time, my father, grew up where he had to work for everything that he had, and nothing was given to him on a silver platter. So he told me, well, if you want to write this book, you better go out and do it. I'm not going to help you in any way. So I was like so determined. I'd written out the story. I'd drawn all the pictures. I had like this illustration book. And I basically made a hole through the paper, got a string, tied it up, and went back to my dad and said, okay, here's the book. And he was like, what, you actually did this? I was like, yeah, so now can we make it into a real book and sell it in the shops? And he was just like, he was really impressed with me. And I think the story, what's interesting about The Lonely Tiger as a story is that at that time as a child, I wasn't fully understanding the morals and the values that I was trying to share, because a lot of the values and morals in The Lonely Tiger are about friendship, but they're also about forgiveness, and they're about overcoming any sense of loneliness or hardship. And I think it was my little way of uniting myself to these children. So they were orphans and they were lonely. And I was an only child. So they kind of became like my brothers and sisters. But it was this concept that people will always try to bring us down, whether that's through jealousy in The Lonely Tiger, it's through all the animals are jealous of the Lonely Tiger. But what we have to do is forgive, and we have to seek love, essentially, and kindness. We have to share what we have. And the idea of that book, and I remember, I mean, you can look on YouTube, there's a lot of videos of when I was younger, is that it doesn't matter what you look like on the outside, is what I said. I remember there's like this video, I'm like, it doesn't matter what you look like, it's what you are in the inside. And in my way, I think that really meant that it doesn't matter your race, your gender, your religion, your age, your nationality. What matters is who you are as a person and how you treat other people. And it was my way of saying that even if you don't have family, you can always have friends that become family. And I'm a friend to you. So that's a bit of a background to the Lonely Tiger.
It's absolutely, it's incredible to even hear it a second and a third time, because I think there's something more that I personally take away from your story and your experiences at that time. That it just feels so right. And I'm really interested in how you, even at that age, you were able to sort of articulate those feelings. And I think that's maybe something that's, I mean, you'd be best to tell me over time that it has developed, sure. But was there ever conversations, perhaps around the dinner table or on your walks or visits to those orphanages or Harare Children's Home, with your mom being like, this, Tatiana, this is the reality at the moment, and this is how we are different, economically, financially, or however you want to put it. Were those conversations quite prevalent with your parents, or in your own sort of through illustrations as you wrote more stories?
Yeah, 100%. I think something that I really value in my upbringing is that my parents always treated me like I was an adult. So the conversations they had, they never, and I think a large reason for this is because I was the only child, right? So I didn't have brothers or sisters at my age that I could kind of just talk to. And I craved a lot of my parents' attention. And so at the dinner table, they would be talking about their day-to-day businesses and experiences, and they would just be openly sharing with me. And what I really love and appreciate of my parents is that when I had an opinion for something that they were saying, they wouldn't like belittle me and say, oh, like, you don't know anything, you're just a kid. They would listen to me and they'd ask me questions and they'd say, why do you think that? And then they'd challenge me and they'd, educate me on certain issues. But definitely since a young age, my father especially always taught me business, and I didn't recognize it, but like everything that he would do, even on his own entrepreneurial journey, he would ask me for his advice. And so obviously, growing up in Zimbabwe, there was a lot of economic upheaval. And so I started understanding just from conversations that my father would have, whether it be with partners or with family, he would always speak about it openly in front of me. And I think because I was exposed to this, because a lot of us are very sheltered and in different ways. And I feel like even later on in life, I felt like I was very sheltered. And, if we get to that conversation, it'll happen naturally. That's kind of fast forward to 2016 when I spoke at the UN. That was the first time in my life where I felt like I took a lot of things for granted. And it was strange to me because I'd been brought up to appreciate things and to kind of be exposed and not be in this little bubble. So definitely the conversations that we had since a young age, and I think this is something that I see myself as wanting to engrave in my, personality and character, especially towards my children. And I think it's a very important lesson that parents have to do with their kids, is to really encourage them to speak their mind and speak their truth and be creative and share with them all the knowledge that they have. And of course, it's important to shelter, our little brains at a young age from all these terrible things happening in the world. But at the same time, it's very important to give that exposure and have that understanding that what you have in your house and what you have in your own life is not necessarily the exact same circumstances that many people face and have. And so by understanding that, we become more respectful towards other people because we understand the differences amongst ourselves. And it's important to not take the things that we do have for granted.
I couldn't disagree with the thing that you said there. I think that there is so much value that you've just mentioned in that response. and particularly about the relationship with your father around, all types of conversations from that age. If I had to sort of take a trip down my memory lane and just think of my own upbringing, it's something that I can't necessarily put a finger on the kind of like type of vulnerable or iffy, if you can call it that, conversations, the taboo type conversations. And I think it's, there's every person has their battles, every parent has their battles. And every parent, I think, will also turn around and say, if I knew what I knew now, it would be a hell of a lot different story. But to have those kind of conversations and to challenge children or to challenge your own thinking, not for any particular reason other than to stimulate thought and curiosity and an opinion.
Definitely.
Essentially, that's valid and questioned. Is testimony to the kind of work, as you mentioned, we'll get up to sort of at your speech at the UN as well, but it's testimony to the kind of journey and work that you've done. I've known you for about 3 weeks, I think, and I'm not trying to make any assumptions, but just through the bit of research that I've had and I've done and the conversations that we've had so far, there's definitely a sort of golden thread that I can see from already those days that have filtered through into sort of who you are today. Would you tend to agree or otherwise?
Yeah, definitely. I think something important to note, though, whilst we're still talking about this, is that the experiences that we have in our life obviously shape, who we become. And some experiences that we have are very positive and they enable us to create more positivity. They sometimes make us more lazy and create negativity rather, and being complacent and ignorant in the world, right? But at the same time, sometimes the experiences that we grow up with that are very negative fuel our desire to create a more positive future. And in my father's case, I think his upbringing, which, isn't the focus of this podcast, obviously, but his upbringing was a very difficult one. And he recognized, and since I was a little girl, he always said to me, I don't want these chains that have bound me to be bound to my future generations. I need to break those chains. And so it really is up to us to make those decisions to break away from the past that we feel like constrained us. And it's a generational thing. But my father always told me, whatever I do for you, it's the reason I'm doing it for you is so that you can do better for your children. Because if we become better by generations, our generations will improve. And so I think it's definitely those experiences that shape you. And my father's and my mother's experiences, which are both very different and unique, shaped me to be enabled in a position where I can create this positive impact that I want. So it's definitely, I don't believe in, coincidences. It's not luck. I think it was preordained. And I think that everybody has their own experiences, but it's the choices we make in our life that define who we are.
Of course, 100%. There's actually a beautiful phrase or a quote that's on the Lonely Tiger, the Lonely Tiger website, where in the last paragraph of the introduction to what the website is about, you actually quoted saying, it's the idea of giving a hand up, not necessarily a handout. I'd like to use that in sort of taking the next step in our conversation around how have you tangibly applied that sort of that knowledge or that phrase into the very next venture that you perhaps happen to like participate in. What then happened, if you wouldn't mind sort of transgressing us later on down the timeline? So the book was published.
Sure.
You were perhaps exposed to a whole different stream of things that are happening and conversations that are happening, because now you're having to sort of publicize the book, but then the ramifications thereafter as well. Would you mind just sort of taking us through that? No, of course,
yeah. So actually the term give a hand up rather than a hand out, I coined that term to a man called Bobby Sager. And Bobby Sager visited my family when I was probably around maybe 9 or 10 for the first time. So it was definitely after I'd written the book. And he's a very successful American businessman turned philanthropist who, long story short, I can't remember the name of the company, but I can follow this up if you're very interested. He created this ball that doesn't essentially break. So it's like a soccer ball, but if you puncture holes in it, it just re-expands and it doesn't get destroyed at all. And so
Right.
by him visiting a lot of African countries, he noticed that a lot of, especially African kids, loved playing soccer. And they used to like wrap up, cans together and plastic bags and make little balls with it, but it'd get destroyed. And so he created this ball where it's like this special foam. I don't know what kind of technology is used in it, but you can get a knife, and I've tried this, and you can stab into this ball and puncture it, and it'll just re-expand. It doesn't get destroyed. And so he came out, giving out all these balls to kids in the community so that the soccer ball could last them a lifetime. And I think it's very integral to his understanding of what team building is supposed to be and how society interacts with each other through sports. But more specifically, he was always talking about giving a hand up rather than a hand out. So rather than just coming and bringing money and, giving food, allow communities to become self-sustainable. And so I obviously, went and asked my dad, like, what does this mean? What does it really mean to give a hand out and not, a hand up and not a hand out? And my father would explain exactly that, what I just said to you. Rather than giving money, you're giving them an exercise that they can do in order to make themselves money. And what I understand it to be today is essentially being self-sufficient and sustainable. So my own practice of like trying to implement that ideal, because I recognize, wow, this is something interesting. I think this is good. I think it's better to give people something that they can then create on their own and be responsible for, rather than just handing them money or food. And one experience I think that started after the Lonely Tiger, if we look at it in a chronological time frame, is I joined an initiative together with the Zimbabwean Youth Parliament, which was about that specific year. It was about saving children living in the streets. And so I formed a trust called Tariro Nevana, which in Shona means Hope for the Children, in together collaboration with the the Zim Youth Parliament. And what I did was I went out to the streets. Actually, I was around 12 or 14 between those 2 years at that time, with my brother, who is an adopted brother. My father financially adopted him. He was born and raised in the rural areas in Zimbabwe. Incredibly smart. His name's Denzel. And we can save that, for another time if you want to talk about it, or in this podcast, entirely up to you. But Denzel and I went out into the streets together, completely alone, with a notebook and a pen. And we started asking kids that we'd see on the streets, like, how did you end up on the streets? What are the reasons for this? And what we started noticing is that a lot of them came from abusive families where they didn't feel like a home environment was safe anymore. And obviously ending up on the streets, they formed a lot of drug addictions. So giving them money or giving them some kind of capsule was dangerous, because it's most likely that they'd use that for drugs. But what was so amazing is that all of them had dreams, and passions and career aspirations. They all wanted an education. They wanted some sort of schooling. They wanted some sort of creative lessons. Like one of them was an artist. And so what we did with Tariro Nevana is essentially, instead of us going out there and giving them food and money, which of course, we did bring them food many times. But what we focused on doing is providing them with the skills and the resources that they needed to explore their skills. So you're from South Africa. I'm sure you've seen, on the side of the streets, you get these cards with wires on them, and, people on the streets make them and they sell them, right? So one group of these kids, probably around between 10 and 18, really wanted to make these cards. So we came and brought them all the necessary resources they needed, like paint brushes, wire cards and pens and whatever, and basically allowed them to have these resources so that they could go out and sell the cards and make the money on their own. And when you go through the hard work of actually creating something, you make money for it, you're going to want, your first instinct is to survive, to eat food, right? So you're now spending more time doing something that you love, that gives you purpose or a sense of meaning, than making yourself feel lost and dizzied by taking drugs or whatever it might be. So that's just an example of the concept of giving a hand up rather than a hand out. And I think that's definitely a concept that I've tried to implement in my company today.
Right. The quote you made now, the point you made now about everyone having dreams as well and wanting to follow through those, regardless of their situation, regardless of their upbringing in a way, yet that being the commonality amongst us as individuals and as well as a community is one that I, at least in the sort of work that I'm involved in now, is one we're often talking about. The communities in which we're working in South Africa and the kind of students and people we're engaging with are more often than not in a very similar environment that the one you described. Mass confusion, one that is really difficult for us to try and understand as well, because it's what we haven't physically been through it, so you might be able to empathize, but there's another element of it that is just so difficult to sort of grasp. And I'm curious to know how you managed to, even at that age, you've grown up, you've had certain experiences, but how you were using the sort of difficulties that you were experiencing or the challenges that you were coming across, and then internalizing them into sort of something tangible or creating an opportunity for yourself to help somebody else. It's a very poorly framed question, but I guess where I'm trying to go with this is trying to figure out, like, what was your process in like when you would come across something that was like either quite dire or it challenged your privilege or your insecurities? What was that process like?
Well, I think I really learned how to create my own mechanism to fighting off, very, very dire, as you mentioned, circumstances and creating something positive out of them only later on in life. An example that I can give you is obviously speaking. So for those of you that are listening, in 2016, I was working for, and I'm still a global council member of an NGO, which is a non-governmental organization called World Merit. And essentially World Merit is really an incredible nonprofit that provides a platform to empower youth all over the world to contribute to the United Nations global agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I got involved in that nonprofit in 2016. And that year I was invited to speak at the UN on the Sustainable Development Goal number 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions. And the reason I'm kind of providing a bit of context to that is there was 360 of us youth that had met up in Philadelphia and New York for this UN event. And we were all split up into different groups. And basically the group around Sustainable Development Goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, there was around, I think, like 24 of us, and we were from 19 different countries. And one of the people in that group was a Syrian young man who I became very good friends with. And essentially he has an unbelievable story. He grew up, obviously Syria is in civil war, and we know that. And I'd studied it at university. And it almost like, a lot of the deaths almost became inhumane. They just became like numbers in a way. Like you just like hear these numbers of deaths and you can't relate to them on a human level. And when I met this young man, it was just unbelievable to hear what he had experienced and what he had gone through and how many family members and friends he'd lost to war, and having to grow up in an environment where you have the sound of drones and drone strikes happening. I mean, his fiance was killed in a bomb attack. His best friend was killed in a bomb attack. And hearing his story is something that really, really affected me in my life. And for 2 years, I struggled with myself because at that moment, I had understood that I'd taken a lot of things for granted. And just to give you a little bit of a story, when we were there at New York, And Huday and I were actually working, his name is Huday. We were working on a project together, and he received a phone call from the British Council that said that his best friend had been killed in a bomb attack. And I was assigned to him to basically make sure that he was okay. And he started sharing a lot of details of his upbringing and personal experience, which is just very traumatic and difficult to bear. But I started understanding that, wow, I have been so privileged in my life, not only from an economic standpoint, just the simple fact that me and my family have never, ever had to face war. We don't understand what that really is. And what was incredible out of that experience was we got together as a team, and the team leaders, like the facilitator, basically put a water bottle in the middle of the circle and said, okay, this is a microphone. If anyone feels comfortable, share your story. And this was because we wanted to bring our team closer together after what had happened to our friend. And of course, Huday started sharing his story, and it was incredible that it shared this ripple effect of people that now started sharing their deepest, darkest, personal journeys and experiences. And it sounds cheesy, but we became so bonded through this emotional experience that we had a new level of respect towards one another and the different circumstances that we came from. And so to answer your question about how I overcome difficulties, I think it really, for me, this was a breaking point in my life, because after this stage, I would go back to the life that I was living. And I did have a very privileged upbringing. And I just could not understand. I faced a lot of guilt. Why so many people had things so difficult for them, and why I had things easier. So not to say that everything was easy, because there was a lot of, personal circumstances that had happened that were not great. And it's never good to kind of compare yourself and your own experiences to others. But out of this experience, I felt like I'd gone into a very dark hole. I was studying international relations at King's College. So I was studying a lot of wars, a lot of conflicts, a lot of problems in the international system, whether that be political, economic, social, poverty. I started studying a lot of these terrible things that are happening in the world. And I started questioning myself, well, who am I? This little girl, this small, tiny little girl who thinks that she can change the world. There's no way I can do anything to improve what's happening in the world. And I went into my own dark hole where I just felt hopeless, and I felt like I couldn't do anything significant enough to make a change. And I think what really helped me was twofold. So on the one side, it was definitely family oriented. On the other side, it was spiritual. And when I say spiritual, it was a mixture between religion and also my own journey of trying to learn about who I am and how I can work through these issues. Because when I felt like I had hit rock bottom, I recognized to myself, there's only two options that I have: to allow myself to continue feeling guilty and sorry for myself and sorry for everything that's going on, and that feeling hopeless, like I can't do anything, or I can pick myself up and I can only go up from here. I can't fall down anymore. I can only go up, and I can try. The only thing I can do is try. And so from a family perspective, it was really incredible, because my parents started reminding me of my childhood and how strong I was opinionated as a child, and how I said at the age of 7 years old, it doesn't matter the difference that you make in this world. If you can change one person's life, whether that's to make that person smile or make their life better in one way or another, you've changed the world. And so these small reminders empowered me to believe that, of course, I can't do everything, but I can start with something, and I can do the best that I can do. And on the other hand, I think spiritually is what really saved me, because I understood more about my purpose and the mechanisms that I'd built, whether that be through prayer or meditation or exercising like through yoga, was just a technique for me to calm myself, keep myself grounded, And then I would just visualize and explore ways that I could actually move forward and find new pathways to achieve my purpose.
Oh, thank you for sharing, especially the story that you did. I will be lying if I say I didn't have this massive lump in my throat right now.
I was trying to get through the words properly without breaking down, but
I could see, and this warmth or this like sort of pressure on my chest as well. I mean, thank you for just sharing that.
Thank you for listening.
And I guess your experience is going out of it. I mean, the reason I also ask is that because, as you mentioned, everyone fights their own battles, right? And I think the danger is it's very easy to compare someone's situation to your own, and to either fall victim to those thoughts, or to use it in a non-malicious way, but in a way that at least makes us feel a little bit more entitled or better about ourselves. And unless someone puts in the work to truly understand the way they think and the way you did once you've hit quote unquote rock bottom, that the only next thing to possibly do is to try to take a step forward, whichever direction that may be, just like the next step, and then build the momentum up. I think it's like those little battles that we challenge ourselves with absolutely daily, and those little things like yoga and meditation and breathing 10 breaths before are just constant reminders that this is the journey, and this is the
I think it's really all a matter of choice. So we all have one thing that no one can ever take away from us is our freedom to choose. And yes, I agree. Some circumstances for people may seem like you don't have the right to choose, especially those that are socially and politically oppressed in countries where they don't have freedom of speech, where they don't have freedom of movement. And I agree that it's more difficult for them. But the right to choose stems from how you want to feel about yourself. And so exactly what you're saying, all these techniques that are like coping mechanisms for us. I think many people think like, oh, this sounds so great, but like, how do you do it? It's not easy. And I think one thing that's important to note is exactly, I think you mentioned, it's a process. It's not something that automatically you do one day and you feel super motivated and you start writing in your journal, you start writing your feelings, you start planning, goal setting, meditating, doing yoga, going to the gym, executing your tasks. It doesn't work like that. Many days you feel like you don't want to get out of bed. You just want to watch Netflix and chill, You don't want to, but at the end of the day, it's a choice. And it is by doing these small and simple things consistently over time that yield results. And that's actually in the words of Robin Sharma from his book, The 5 a.m. Club, which is another thing that really helped me in my life. And what I noticed about it is really habit forming, right? It's about us being consistent with our actions, because without forming the habits that we want, we will never become the people we want to be, essentially. And so it is a choice, and it takes a lot of courage and bravery to put yourself in a situation where you're now on a path to become a person you want. But I think that the key thing here is that it's not easy, and that you can't fall in love with the idea of where you want to be or who you want to be or where you want to end up. You've got to fall in love with the process and the idea of who you are now, and how you are being a better version of yourself each and every day, and falling in love with that process itself, and really yearning to want to love yourself and do good by yourself and your community is something that you end up recognizing, creates the best version of yourself in the long run.
I could not agree more. I'm so glad you brought up Robin Sharma's book as well, because as you were explaining this point right now, the first thing for some reason that popped straight into my mind was a question to ask you if you've read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
No, I haven't. Before? I'm going to add it to my book list.
Okay, you absolutely have to, because I mean, if this is the way you perceive processing and journeying, at least the opportunity to give yourself a chance to try out that choice, to see what a choice might be. It's one of those books. I think there's about 150 pages in it, but you'll probably need to read it about 3 to 4 times. And he's just, it is phenomenal. Every time I happen to come across it, there's something new to take out of it. And me saying anything in a nutshell would not do justification to the kind of the literature he's put out and the principles and just the thought process that he expresses. I would highly
Please
recommend it.
Yeah.
And for those that are listening as well, please find out. There should be online numerous copies you can find from all over. I think it's on Audible as well. But if you can get your hands on a hard copy, paperback, it's nothing better. Ironically, I think those that have tuned into the last episode, I mentioned about the book I'm reading now, and I'm still currently halfway through it, which is Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And there's a particular verse that I came across this morning, in fact, about the desire that one has to better themselves, right? And Think and Grow Rich is he often uses that of sort of a monetary value to I suppose somewhat to paint the picture a little bit better for us to understand what he's trying to say. But something which struck with me is working on that process, is working on the mindset to not fall victim all the time. And I'm sort of trying to word what I'm going to get to next, but the choice in which we're all confronted with daily, I think is one that's really, really tough to make, whether it be a career change, or getting out of bed, or just simply exploring our own mindsets a little bit more. And something which I try really, really hard to bring in as a golden thread through every episode is, for anyone who's listening, there's listening not just for the sake of consumption, but listening for the sake of clear
and growth.
So the things that you mentioned, and growth, exactly. So the little bits and pieces that you're saying, yes, there's wisdom in knowing that it's not easy and acknowledging that and giving respect to that. But there's also like picking up the books that are mentioned, or sitting down with the journal, or trying out yoga just to experiment. I think it goes a hell of a long way, and eventually something somewhat clicks at a particular time in your life. That's just like the perfect pivot. It's like, I needed this right now. This particular verse or this particular moment or person makes sense. And that is often then the stimulus to like the next thought, the next curiosity.
Well, Matt, what I find really incredible about Outcome Podcast is that whole concept of growth. And I think people underestimate how sharing the lessons that you've learned in life fuel your ability to also learn more, but at the same time share your own lessons. And I think just by listening to the people, that you speak to, there's so much that I've already learned from you. And I think the incredible thing is that as human beings, we have to have this sense of humility where we understand that we will never know everything, right? There's always room to acquire more knowledge and more self-growth, whether that be, for career or just for yourself as a person or for your relationships, whatever that might be. By sharing each other's stories and valuable lessons that we learn in life, we are actually empowering each other. And so it's so important, at least for me, and from what I gathered when we first met and spoke, was what I really like about meeting people like you is that you fuel and motivate me to be the best version of myself. And you have these deep conversations that matter in life, because at the end of the day, it's almost selfish. It's like an addiction. It's like I crave these people to be around me because it makes me so motivated and inspired to do more and learn more, and not necessarily like try to be the most incredible thing out there, but to be better and be better for and stand up for, the things that I love and the people that I love, and be a good example and influence over them. So I think it's really valuable just having these conversations. And I want to applaud and commend you on this, because just hearing you speak and these books that you throw out there. And I've actually heard a couple of your other speakers in your podcast mention some books. They've inspired me. I'm like, whoa, I haven't heard this book before. I want to go read it, because I know that you're doing it because it's helped your life in one way or another. It's inspired you. And if there's something that I can bring and learn from that would, be so incredible. So it's really awesome.
Thank you. Truly, I heartfeltly and appreciate that. Your compliments and just the way you've experienced the podcast. That is ultimately the goal as well. There is the deeper conversation, which some argue it might be a little bit too much, too often, which is had even the ones at home. But on the other hand, it's helping, it's giving a hand up, right? It's opportunities there to take it and use it as you will. And the beauty of I think this platform is that it's just one of many platforms of many other sort of resources that people have used to just add to that already existing space. And the way I had come across podcasts, at least, was that there was a gem or a book or a recommendation that, again, at that moment, profoundly changed my perspective, at least for that period. And it helped, transition me into like the next best thing or the next sort of thought process, which ultimately is like that growth that we're alluding to. I'm really interested. You brought it up now, just a little bit earlier, and I think it's the perfect sort of segue to go into. But your introduction to the Sustainable Development Goals, to the United Nations, to Merit
World
Council,
Merit,
if I have that right? World Merit. That's right. And although those are three very broad sort of topics in different periods of your life, I want to keep that as sort of point two. But just before then, if I try and work it in a chronological order, you've had a bit of experience with an organization, as far as I have, called Right to Play, as an intern. Do you mind just giving a bit of perspective on what that experience was like and what you were actually doing there?
Yeah. So, well, I don't know how I'm going to frame this answer because there's so much going on in my head right now. But whilst we're on the topic of, following who you want to be and what you want to do and what you're passionate about, what drives you, at this point in my life, I was very, very conflicted because I was approaching soon to finishing my degree. I think I had like a year or two left, and I was getting pressure from my father, who's always believed in me. Pressure from my father to fall into regular societal standards and expectations of where we need to go, right? Getting a really good job. You've gotten into one of the best universities in the world. You need to get a good grade so you can graduate with a great degree and get, a very good job and go work here and do this. And I'd kind of always just been like, yeah, okay, like we'll deal with that when it comes. For now, I'm just going to intern and go to, do things that really I want to be exposed to. But in my heart, I always knew that wasn't me. I knew I wasn't going to go work for a consultancy firm like PwC. I knew that that's not something I wanted to do. And I was conflicted because I have my father, who I look up to and respect above anyone else, almost encouraging me to do this. So my experience with Right to Play, I had actually reached out to somebody at the UN, at UNHCR, and it was after my experience with the UN in New York, where I spoke, and my experience with my friend Hode and learning about, Syria. And I really wanted to see refugees. I actually wanted to go join the UN peacekeeping force, which is like basically the army. If you don't know what it is, it's like the army for the UN.
Yeah.
And I wanted to go to the Syrian civil war and help with humanitarian aid. And my father didn't allow me. He said that he doesn't, feel that that's my purpose. And he feels like if something had to happen to me, I wouldn't be able to help more people in the way that I wanted. And I was heartbroken by that. But I tried to find something that we could all compromise on and agree with, because I really wanted to work in that environment. I'd never been to the Middle East, and I really wanted to meet refugees and learn more about their experiences. And obviously I love kids. The Lonely Tiger today is a company and a brand that empowers children to receive an education. And so whether that be through the original book, this is a secret, but because I love this podcast so much, I'll share it. I've actually started writing some extra episodes. So it's part of a series of the Lonely Tiger friends that travel the world, and they solve a global goal at a time. And so it's a series that's an animation. Okay. They're all cartoons. And I only started writing it last year. So like in the first episode, they go and they rescue sea turtles that are caught up in plastic and educate kids to, reuse, reduce, recycle plastic. And then they move, and they basically have all these challenges to do. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because my passion for education and those words that Nelson Mandela said have never left me. So through the Lonely Tiger, we have a lot of different types of educational books and skills that teach children how to read and write at a very young age, and also a lot of the skills that my mother and father used to teach me when I was very young. And so Right to Play just seemed to really fit, because it was working with refugees, which I really wanted to do, and it was also working with children. And so when I'd met with this representative from UNHCR, he had basically said that there was no position for me to work at UNHCR that specific summer, but he did know of an organization like an NGO that he could recommend me to almost go there on mission for and work with them. And so that's how that originally started. I went to Lebanon alone. It was the first time I'd ever traveled. I mean, I travel alone a lot, but it was the first time I ever traveled to a new country and a new region completely alone. So when I landed in Lebanon, it was at night, and we went through like 3 military checkpoints. And at that time, it's because they're trying to search for Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization. And the part of Lebanon where I was working, I mean, I was based in Beirut, but the part where I was working was very close to the Syrian border. We'd go out there on field trips because that's where the refugees would be based. And something that really shocked me, that was crazy to me, is I had this idea in my head that the UN refugee camps were like this, incredible white, massive tent with like, beds and areas for like healthcare, and basically like a major luxury tent is what I had in mind, right? And when you look on pictures online, that's what you'll see. And I was absolutely devastated when we went to one of these refugee camps, and I had never seen anything. I mean, I come from Zimbabwe, and I think the closest I can relate to this is my experiences in India in the slums. It was so incredibly unhygienic, so dangerous. There was like electricity and water cables hanging from the roofs. And it was just really eye-opening is what it was. But working with these kids was a very interesting experience, because what the NGO does, Right to Play, is they have these classrooms that are built like almost like 5-star classrooms, super clean, incredible conditions. And they bring in these kids and they educate them on all these different topics that are so different to traditional education. And this is really what also inspired my thinking around sustainability, actually, because these kids' classes weren't like theoretical. They were extremely practical. So one of the exercises that I was involved in with some Syrian kids, they were probably around the ages of like 10 to 14. And it was like a physics class, I think. It was some sort of a science class. And basically, it was like the showcasing day where the kids were showing what they built. These kids had built ovens where they can cook food with like things that you can find in your backyard. Wow. I'm talking about like a cardboard box with a glass and like tinfoil. And they were showing how it works to cook food. They build their own air conditioners where they had like plastic bottles with like layers of toothpicks where you'd put the ice in and basically hold it so that the wind would blow it out and blow cool air. They built their own solar panels. They built their own generators, their own car engines. I mean, some of the things I saw was just insane. And the reason behind this was the whole concept of sustainability. This NGO, Right to Play, really believes that you need to educate, especially Syrian children, how they can go back to their own countries and rebuild, and how they can, in the short term, go to the refugee camps and become self-sustainable and self-sufficient and rely on themselves. And Right to Play obviously has a unique approach to education through games. So that's why it's called Right to Play. They educate children through interactive games and activities. But yeah, I think that was definitely a standout moment for me. And my experience with Right to Play definitely helped me gain a much clearer understanding of on the ground work of what sustainability means, especially for communities that are underprivileged, that don't have things for them, how important it is for them to be self-sustainable, because you expect organizations like the UN to just, provide them food and electricity, but it's not like that. And it's not the UN's responsibility to take care of, the whole world. They're doing the best they can, right? And I think there's a lot of faults definitely that the UN has, especially in the international legal system. But in this specific light, I think it's really important to invest our money in providing communities with ways that they can then help themselves in the long run.
Just before you wrap up that thought, there's not an organization, but a project that you were involved in whilst with Right to Play, as far as I understand, where you were involved with creating the first livelihood strategy for gain
Yeah.
opportunities and access to
Yeah.
livelihoods, or other words, goal. What exactly was that?
Sure. So this is actually
Would you mind
really
just giving a bit of
interesting.
context?
Like if you ever want to help your community or get involved in kind of humanitarian work, but at the same time have an entrepreneurial mindset and, you know, think logically about giving a hand up rather than a handout, this is such an incredible exercise to practice. So what GOAL stands for, as you mentioned, is gaining opportunities and access to livelihoods. And essentially what Right to Play did in their own goal strategy was they first had profiling sessions with children, vocational sessions, and then they had, well, let's go through them real quick. So profiling is basically where they assess. So something that is important to note here is in Lebanon specifically, Lebanon never signed onto the 1950 Convention on the Status of Refugees, which means that they are not refugees in the country, are not legally recognized to work as doctors or lawyers or regular workforce jobs. They're not allowed to because Lebanon hasn't recognized the 1950 Convention on the Status of Refugees. So legally, they're not allowed to work in those jobs. So what Right to Play did, since they work with kids and educating kids, is they first assessed, and that was actually part of my job, is figuring out what is legal in Lebanon, which is why the strategy that I'd come up with, the assessment, was comparing the Lebanese crisis response and also the UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program, and implementing Right to Play's strategy so that it fits into the legal and you know contextual foundations of Lebanon as a country. So, for example, the way that refugees are allowed to work is by wood cutting, beekeeping, fashion, like hair and design. And so what Right to Play would do is basically they'd create these profiling sessions where rather than educating kids on maths and law, like, you know, the regular topics that we learn is unfair because if they're going to grow up, they can't actually put those they can't survive at the end of the day. They can't be self-sufficient because they can't have that opportunity in the country. So what they do is they first profile them. They go to different classes where they experiment with all these different job opportunities, but it's practical. So they learn wood cutting, they learn beekeeping, they learn all these practical jobs. And then they have vocational training, which is where they now go into, you know, the teachers get trained specifically, and then those teachers go and train the kids that have chosen their career path. So it is unfair because imagine being very young, you have to basically choose your career path at a young age. But that is the only way for you to make an income for your family. And this is obviously for a later stage for kids. So between the ages of 16 and 18. And then once they've been educated on this, basically what they do is they now become entrepreneurs. And this is where is a really incredible, valuable lesson. So what the UNDP did is create a microcredit financing scheme for refugees that are legally operating in job opportunities that they're allowed to do, and provide them with microcredit financing loans that they could then use to start up their own businesses. And as their businesses become profitable, they would pay back the money. And in order to get more money, that's how it would work. So I would look at microcredit financing for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, to help, you know, people in communities become entrepreneurs. And also yourself have, if you are an entrepreneur like myself, you'll have this mindset of, well, how is it going to be profitable? How is it going to work in the long run? And so what's really incredible here is that it's secure, and in a way it's risk-free because you're not losing money. You're not giving out a large chunk of money that you're losing. And on the other hand, what's incredible is that the Lebanese government was extremely happy and excited about this because essentially the refugees, a lot of people argue that refugees drain out the economy. They take the jobs that people have to do. And so those arguments wouldn't hold because the sectors in the economy that we're lacking are essentially getting filled by new job creation by these refugees. So it just seemed like a really win-win situation where I feel like that kind of a strategy would definitely work in a lot of African countries as well. You know, being from Zimbabwe, I think a lot of developing countries could use that in their own communities. So yeah, that's a bit of Right to Play and the goal strategy.
Fascinating. Incredible. That's absolutely incredible. And I mean, I just can't help but compare, or not compare, but want to take a lot of these recommendations and I guess the lessons that you've experienced and almost immediately try to apply them in my own little world and in sphere at the moment. And I'll put in a few of Tatiana's contact details after this conversation, of course, so that I'm sure she'll be happy to answer if you have any questions yourself or have a look at Lonely Tiger and the likes thereof. So there will be lots of information around for those listeners that are wanting more. I do, because we could talk about this, I think, forever. Sure. I want to slowly segue into something you've brought up quite a few times now is your experience working with the United Nations, as well as your introduction to the Sustainable Development Goals. Much of what your business at the moment is sort of is based upon. And I would love to know at what stage, maybe if it even was subliminally through your upbringing, that you were always exposed to those kind of conversations or topics. But at what time did you realize, okay, you know what, there's something that needs to be done, and I want to play my part, going to World Merit or getting involved on a global scale, from Zimbabwe. Where did that come?
Sure. Well, so I finished high school in Switzerland. I did my last 2 years at a boarding school in Switzerland. And that was before I went on to do my undergrad at King's College. And whilst I was in my last 2 years, I was leading a club called MUN, which is Model United Nations. And it was really incredible because we obviously got to practice it. And we had a lot of opportunities to travel. So we traveled to Beijing. Harvard hosted the annual MUN that year. And we traveled to the UK, we traveled to Rome. And what's really awesome about MUN is that it kind of gives you an understanding of how things work practically within the UN, because you're putting yourself in the situation where you're acting as a delegate. And you're pretending, like at one stage I was the Russian the Russian delegate for the Security Council. And the topic was protecting journalists' rights, freedom of speech rights, which obviously Russia means, let's not get too much into detail here on the podcast. I am half Russian, but it's very questionable, okay, to say lightly. And I didn't choose that. I was given that. And as Russia, you're essentially one of the 5 permanent Security Council members. And so you really learn what happens in the UN, because everybody conspired against me. They wanted to veto, they wanted my law out. And when I'd walk into the classroom, which was when we were ready for the initial debate. And of course, at that age, we all want to win, being best delegate. And that's what motivates and inspires you to do all these silly things like, lock a girl out of classroom and conspire against her. And just funny things like that. I mean, I'd take my chair and sit in the middle of the circle and I'd say, right, whatever you're agreeing to do without me, I have the power of veto. And if you don't include me in the discussions, I'll just veto whatever you say. So you're wasting your time, And that just gives you a bit of an understanding to how things actually work. The power of veto is real. And getting involved in MUN really started shaping my understanding to how the UN operates as an international organization, maintaining international affairs. And I had always been very interested in law. I thought I was going to be a lawyer when I was a kid. But learning, and history was my favorite subject. So this combination between almost on an international level, playing this legal role was extremely fascinating to me. And I'd been extremely fascinated by international politics and relations because naturally, I think of my upbringing, I'm very mixed nationality. It's very hard for me to explain to people where I'm from. Like I said, my father's, English. My mother's half Russian, half Ukrainian. I was born in Zimbabwe. I lived in Switzerland. I lived in the UK. So it's very difficult for me to explain that. And having that worldly experience and understanding and visiting many countries, I was fascinated by the concept of international relations. So after high school, I went on to study international relations and specialized in international law at university. And this is where I started really getting involved and learning more about the UN and learning more from like a legal perspective, you know, the different laws that happen on an international level. And there's just so much to talk about, Matt, that we're going to have a second podcast here, because there's a lot of fascinating things that I'd love to share, you know, if you want to hear it. But what's important is the SDG question. And I think at some stage I was trying to figure out, okay, where can I find something that is going to give me the room to explore all these different things that I want to do. And honestly, the UN SDG framework just struck out to me. So when I'd heard about this NGO World Merit, and that they were like helping youth all around the world contribute to the UN SDGs, I was like, wow, this is incredible, because I'm not just like sitting in university and I'm learning about all these different things. I have an opportunity to be a young person and contribute to this global agenda. And that was so exciting for me. And so basically what happened was I applied for this, I got in, and that was really my first time of learning specifically about the Sustainable Development Goals, because I'd obviously been very familiar with the UN, and that was like a pathway to understanding and learning more about the SDGs. But this experience is really when I started learning a lot about the Sustainable Development Goal framework. And for those of you that are listening and have no idea what I'm talking about, essentially the global goals, so the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, were agreed in 2015 by all member countries in the world to enforce this global agenda for these 17 global goals to be achieved by 2030. And so these goals kind of range from, for example, number 1 is no poverty, number 2 is no hunger, number 3 is health and well-being, 4 is quality education, 5 is gender equality, 12 responsible consumption and production, 13 is climate change, I think 7 is like renewable energy and clean energy. So they really are very broad ranging. And I think what really was incredible to me about these global goals was that I could relate to almost all of them. So within my own upbringing, my own experience, I'd look at no poverty. What I love about the global goals that many people don't know or understand fully, because it's still a new concept to many people, is that there's targets and indicators to measure and achieve these goals. So obviously now you have a framework, a global framework, that by some miracle all countries in the world have actually agreed on, which is very difficult in international politics. People will always disagree and veto. So the simple fact that all countries in the world agreed on this framework, well, the countries that are part of the UN, is a miracle in itself. But then you have a framework where you can actually measure sustainable development. So now you know that the target and indicator for no poverty, for example, is to increase, wages for or increase national GDP to be X or Y or whatever it might be. And there's specific targets and indicators, like many of them, per each global goal. And so obviously I was fascinated by this idea. Okay, right, there's this system where I can go out and know exactly where I can start creating a positive impact in order to create sustainability. But the more I got involved with it, and this is where, obviously I learned a lot of faults that are with the UN through university, but practically speaking, and I do have so much respect for the UN because they are the only international organization that essentially do maintain international peace and security. But at the same time, when I got involved in this framework, after speaking at the UN, after, my initial involvement with the framework and with the stakeholders involved in this, I started finding a lot of problems, and they really frustrated me because I started saying, okay, well, this is great, but where are we? What countries are doing what? Like, how well are we doing as a global population to actually achieve these global goals? Because you have already expressed all these alarm bells about how dangerous these issues are, whether it be climate change, right? And whether it be the fact that if the temperature rises to above 3 degrees Celsius, basically we're all screwed. If you're saying that, then what are countries doing to implement climate change policies? What are countries doing to improve no poverty? Because of course there's a lot of corruption. But what frustrated me was this lack of accountability from countries, this lack of transparency to show this is what we're doing. and the lack of collaboration to work together within their national governments, with the private sector, with the public sector, with universities. And more so, I think that these three biggest overarching problems are not only amongst governments, they're amongst all stakeholders. So whether that be nonprofits, whether that be institutions, whether that be citizens, we're not collaborating together. We're not collaborating on achieving these goals. And so all these issues started piling up, and I was getting frustrated, and I was finding these problems. And I've always been a solution-oriented person, where when I approach a problem, I don't look at it, and I actually hate like observing the causes. Like, it's important, and many historians love that. For me, I will do a quick assessment to understand what are the general causes of this problem. But then I'll spend a lot more time looking at the problem, and then I spend like majority of the time figuring out a solution to that problem. So that's kind of a background story as to what shaped my idea for my company now, which is a startup called Global Impact. And that's, I mean, I think this is something we should maybe save for a future podcast if the audience and yourself would like a part 2. But there's a lot of interesting experiences that I went through that could inspire people, but could also help them form an understanding, especially those that are entrepreneurs, because I obviously wanted to study international law. I wanted to do my master's and PhD in there. And then I completely pivoted. I never expected to go into business. And, the experiences that I gained while studying at Stanford were so invaluable that I feel like I would love to be able to share those lessons with people if it's going to help them grow and start their own companies. But yeah, so that's a bit of a background to the SDGs.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, Tatiana, we will definitely bookmark that conversation for a version 2 or another opportunity to get on. I want to try and treat the next question with as much respect of what you just shared now, and treat it as a sort of pendulum effect where, again, I'm trying to tie this back into you as the individual, but then into the sort of, if I can, the acronym that you mentioned now around accountability, collaboration, and obviously transparency, not just with the SDG, but you as a person. How do you, as I try and describe the pendulum effect, how do you go about your internal your retrospection, your process around? Okay, I've acknowledged that this is an issue. Personally, you've mentioned now you're a solution-oriented person, but what does that look like? Is it reaching out to those people that are nearby? You mentioned a few of the sort of practical things around like yoga or meditation a little bit earlier, and internalizing. Okay, what does this actually mean? And then I suppose, which now swings into the former, which is what does that visualization or that solution programming then look like? How do you find that courage or the motivation to take the next step in whatever it might be, whether it be a global situation or just you go take a book in the flight?
All right, so the secret sauce time. No, well, I think
you can call it that.
On a global level, obviously a lack of accountability and transparency. My frustration was around data and the fact that there was no data available. I'd spent so much time researching this. I think that the way I would describe my visualization, well, first thing is that accountability, collaboration, and transparency are acronyms in my company for ACT, which is our core values, to act. So how do I then act in my day-to-day life? How do I act in the decision-making? How do I act to approach problems and provide solutions for them? Is how I'll try to answer the question. And so I think when I think of myself as a person, obviously being accountable, this stems down from an international level accountability to a national level, to an organizational level, to an individual level. And on an individual level, I believe that we do need to take accountability and responsibility for our actions and recognize that all actions have consequences. If we're doing something positive, the likelihood of that being a positive consequence increases twofold. If we're doing something that is not benefiting our health, that is not benefiting our mental health, that is not benefiting our community, our environment, our personal growth, the likelihood of that consequence being negative is twofold, right? And so accountability is understanding, first of all, that yes, it's difficult. I've made loads of mistakes in the past. And I've wished that I haven't done certain things. But it's important for me to recognize and look back on where I went wrong, on being accountable for my own mistakes and my own problems that I've experienced, in order for me to accept that is the first step before I can go on to providing a solution. Because if I'm ignoring it, I'm essentially putting it under the rug, and I'm not owning up to who I really am. And owning up to who you really are is the most important thing for yourself. You don't need to tell anybody about it. It's between you and yourself, right? But this concept of visualization for me is something that has taken me at least 4 or 5 years to learn to build, and this mechanism of providing solutions. So I think if I had to do it in almost like a step by step, when I immediately find a problem, so whether that be career oriented or personal or family relationship, whatever it might be, that problem, I think as human beings, our initial instinct is either a flight or fight response. So for me as a person, I have a fight response. I don't have that flight response. And I really go head on to it. And so this is unique, for me, and it might be different for other people, but my immediate reaction is to deal with it. And sometimes it's not the best way for other people. Sometimes other people, need time to think about things, and they need to process it, and they need to calm down, and then they need to come back to the table. My immediate natural instinct, thanks to my father's genes, I think, is to deal with it head on. So when I encounter a problem, sure, I'm human. I feel hurt. I feel frustrated. I feel angry. What I do immediately then is ground myself. As soon as I start feeling these emotions that are out of my control, like if I feel like I'm out of control of myself, that's when I start getting stressed and anxious, So I ground myself. I meditate. That's the first thing I do. I close my eyes. I take in deep breaths. You can do the system of whether you are counting in for 7 seconds, holding for 4, and breathing out for 8. That's a really good way to calm yourself down, like very fast. After a couple of times of doing that, 20 times of doing that, you're going to feel a lot calmer. Learning breathing techniques actually has been something that's really helped me deal with anxiety. I used to feel like I deal very badly with anxiety. And I never understood that simply breathing into your stomach rather than breathing into your lungs is a way to immediately provide this sense of calmness. It's almost like a high, because you're inhaling so much air and you're breathing it into your stomach. And when you're exhaling, after doing that again a few times, you calm yourself, right? Now, once I feel like I've calmed myself, what I next do is something that is visualization. I first, in my mind, create a mind map of what the problem is and what the solution that my initial instinct is telling me to do. So I outline all these things. Okay, these are all the problems. What is the possible solution that I can do? Once I've spent time visualizing the solution that I want and truly believing that it's possible, I think something that is so important is having this mental switch in your head where you believe so much that it's possible that there's no doubt, there's no room for doubt. Because if there's room for doubt, you are not able to progress on a speed that you want to, and you end up feeling stressed and anxious again. So you almost manipulate yourself into believing that this is the only way, that this is the right way. And obviously with time, you can assess and have a look at all your options and weigh them out and be more rational. But in that specific environment, I first do visualize, and then I go and I do note taking. So whether that be goal taking, and I write down the goals, that's what I call is it could be tasks, right? But I write down goals. I say, this is the problem. This is the solution that I'm proposing to this problem. And these are the steps that I'm going to take to achieve this solution, right? So that's kind of my thought process behind it. And it's obviously a lot more detailed, but I love also working with mind maps. And I think by physically going through the experience of writing things out and playing with your words, whether it's like writing, essays to yourself about explaining things, or whether it be drawing or painting or actually doing mind maps, everybody, deals with things differently, whether it be listening to your podcast and trying to calm down, trying to get some inspiration, trying to get some perspective. Everybody has to figure out their own mechanisms. For me, what really works, yesterday I was actually dealing with a problem that I briefly mentioned to you before we got on the call. And I immediately, I wish I could show you, but I have on my wall right now about 5 different massive papers like this with mind maps on them. And I go through all those mind maps and they lead to something else. And then I backtrack and I see what is the best route. What is the best valuable route to get to where I'm going?
Right.
And so that kind of provides a solution perspective for me. And that's obviously very career orientated, but you can apply it to relationships. You can apply it to everyday stresses and problems. The first thing that I think is important is grounding, that immediate sense of grounding to gain clarity, to gain perspective, to not be so emotional in your response, especially to the people around you in your environment, and taking control of yourself. Once you're in control of yourself, I think the next steps that you take are very personal and individual to who you are as a person.
Right. It's funny how I think even over, time, we learn to adapt and we learn what works and what doesn't work. And certainly over certain experiences that we go through in trying these different things, where we then shape something that works best for us and that will constantly gain some sort of improvement or development. I'm very, very similar to you. I have those that won't know me well enough, I'm actually looking at it now. I've got a few diaries in front of me. I normally carry around just a smaller, sort of like an A5 type diary, paperback, that I always have in my pockets, and a pen. And it's one of those things where over time, my form of processing has been exactly that, whether it is relationship or is career or just something that I'm frustrated about and I actually can't sit and breathe because I'm in the car or whatever. I just whip that out real quick and I just jot down those thoughts and I jot down the ideas, or I just draw. And I guess the concept in which I'm trying to explore more recently as well is the difference between a synthetic imagination versus creative imagination. And what it does in problem solving and what it does in retrospection is, synthetic imagination is like those things that we know, the things that we can't control and that exist, that are just there. And we acknowledge it for what it is. It's an issue that is prevalent, and it needs some sort of attention. And how does that then lend a hand into the sort of creative imagination, which is now stretching yourself to be like, well, what can I do? And what are my options? Elon Musk always says, look at first principles. It's breaking it down to the root cause and seeing, okay, well, if this is really what it is, whether it be an emotional sort of trauma, quote unquote, like that you're sort of dealing with, or the next business venture, I like you very much. I like to be that sort of visual person, drawing something down. And for those that haven't yet, or perhaps are sort of, I'm in an awe about the experience of it. It's something that's personally, it's fluctuated, it's ebbed and flowed in my life, and it's come and gone. But it is one of the single best coping mechanisms that's just easy to implement, to just try out. And by all means, please, you don't have to treat it as a dear diary, but treat it as a where am I kind of thoughts. And one rule I've sort of tried to implement in my life is not to have any rules. So if I want to swear, if I want to write, if I want to draw, create, or put a hole through the page, that's what I'll do in that moment. And it just gives you that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, because just hearing you speak, when you said something about root cause, what I recognize that could help people listening to this, because it helped me, is whenever we're under a stressful situation, we need to first recognize whether that fear is tangible or intangible. So what I understood is that when something is a tangible fear, it is an immediate threat. It's like I'm swimming in the ocean and there's a great white in front of me. That is a tangible, immediate, imminent threat, right? Yeah. And so what's important is to distinguish the difference between an immediate, tangible threat to threats that are intangible, that are not made up in our minds, but that are not an immediate threat to ourselves. Because those fears of intangible fears that we have are not actually affecting us in the moment. And those specific types of fears that are intangible are the ones that we can then break it down and find a proper rational response to. And I love that you said that there's no rules that should apply, because I totally agree. But I also think that, it's so important to understand beforehand, is this fear real right now in this moment? No, it's not attacking me right now. Okay. Let me ground myself. Let me calm down. Now I understand that's not, affecting me right now. Now let me figure out the steps that I need to take to deal with it. And I really like that you said that there should be no rules around that, because I think that's very true. Everybody has to figure it out for themselves, right? But use the techniques that other people have spoken about, saying that it's helped them, because why not try it out? And it might work wonders for you, right?
Again, one more recommendation, on a book recommendation that certainly helped me in that journey, was Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, where it's just so unapologetically, just ruthlessly honest in what he says. And it was like it was incredible. It was the way it just sort of helped me process what I do now, and also what you're speaking to. Tatiana, there is definitely another conversation we're going to need to have. And I there's a lot more around what Global Impact Network is currently doing, to dig a little bit more into your experiences post the UN speech which you gave, and just I suppose the future thereof. What can we expect to see and hear more of what you're doing? And as you mentioned, you have a couple of cool sort of tools and tricks and principles that you'd like to share with those entrepreneurs that I personally am very intrigued to find out.
Awesome.
I will reach out to you so that we can make sure that we have another date secured. But for now, I'd like to just sort of bring it back in and just thank you for committing some of the time and sharing the stories that you have, and the experiences which you have. Sort of as a closing, we had a very good conversation just in preparation for this, where we spoke about the difference between sort of not the difference, but the ability to be vulnerable in conversation, and what that sort of does to emotional intelligence. And maybe I'm sort of ending this conversation on a high that opens up a whole gateway to another topic.
Sure.
But roll with it if you feel like you'd like to offer a few words here. In just the merit of, expressing that vulnerability, and encouraging whoever might be listening to have a bit of courage, to not only be sort of personally vulnerable, but with that support system that has proven testament to those around you, in your upbringing, and I have in my life as well, certainly. If you wouldn't mind, sort of as a closing, just to share a couple of your thoughts on
course.
that. If that is fair to ask a couple of words.
It's a great way to close, really, because at the end of the day, I believe that being vulnerable is what makes us human. And I think, we all go through our own experiences, whether they be extremely happy and joyful and positive, or traumatic and negative and sad. What's important is to not allow those terrible experiences to define us. Because once we do that, we essentially close who we are, and we don't allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to feel and experience those beautiful, wonderful, happy and joyous moments anymore, because we're so hurt by the past. And if we allow the past to dictate our future, we will never be able to truly appreciate life and all its beauty. And so I think vulnerability, like whether it's something like a relationship, right? And you've been hurt in the past and you feel really upset by it. I think what's so important is forgiveness as well. And I'm laughing to myself because that stems really into my own psychoanalysis of my own understanding of life, right? And The Lonely Tiger, really beginning with that whole forgiveness aspect of being important. But I think sometimes forgiving another person isn't the only way. It's also forgiving yourself, and not being so hard on yourself, not holding yourself so strictly against things that you've done that you might disagree with today. And forgiving yourself, forgiving those people around you, really, it provides a sense of freedom where you can now move forward into the future. And I think that the beauty in being vulnerable is really allowing yourself to feel and experience life in all its forms. And to love is an incredible feeling. To love a person, to love a family member, to love your spouse or your girlfriend or your boyfriend, to love your work, and to love your career choice, and to love nature, and to love all these small and simple things that we do have in our life that we often take for granted, is being vulnerable. And it might be hard, especially if you've suffered a lot in the past, but it will really enable you to feel so incredibly grateful and happy in life that I think vulnerability is very closely linked to happiness. Thank you so much, Matt.
It was beautiful. Thank you. Tatiana, I appreciate your time, and stay tuned for those that are listening. I'm sure we'll be able to sort of rope Tatiana out of her very busy schedule at the moment to get us involved. She says humbly, if only you could see her right now, to unpack a little bit more of sort of professional experiences and the challenges and tribulations and successes that she's experienced there. But
thank you so much, time, Matt. I really appreciate being here, and thank you to everyone that's listening. It's been an awesome conversation.
Hey guys, Matt here again. Just before you run off, thank you for lending me your ears and tuning in once again. I hope that you enjoyed the conversation, and of course I would love to hear any sort of feedback you might have. You can do so through all forms of social media, really. I've probably spammed enough about that. Or through my email, which is outcomepodcast@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you and even to say hello. For those that have any advice on long distance recording, please feel free to share and send through a few links as well. I am an open book and am willing to learn. As usual, if you have any other news, please pass it through. And if you haven't yet subscribed or shared the podcast via the very many links that you could potentially find it on, I encourage you to do so too. Looking forward to hearing from you, and until then, cheers.